welcome. It is wonderful to have you with us today. I'm Mary Beth Gassman, and I'm a professor at Rutgers University, and I also serve as the executive director of the Proctor Institute for Leadership, Equity, and Justice, as well as the Rutgers Center for Minority Serving Institutions. We are very, very excited today to have Gina Nunez with us, who is going to be giving a talk called Feeding and Building Communities of Care on the U.S. Mexico border. And this is part of a humanities-based series that is linked to our Hispanic Serving Institutions Pathways to the Professoriate program. I did want to say a little bit officially about Gina, and that is that she's an associate professor of anthropology and director of women and gender studies at the University of Texas at El Paso. And she is an applied cultural anthropologist with 21 years of applied research and community engagement research in El Paso, Texas, and southern New Mexico. She has expertise in feminist research practices, ethnographic, and applied research on the U.S. Mexico border. And then just a little bit from me personally, I have had the pleasure to work with Gina for several years now on the Hispanic Serving Institutions Pathways to the Professoriate program. And I want to say that she is an absolutely beautiful person, a wonderful mentor. I also recently interviewed her for a book project, and just a wealth of information and care and love and generosity. And we are just thrilled to have you with us here today, Gina, and the stage is yours. We will take questions at the end, so feel free to put them in the Q&A, but Gina is just going to take us through a journey, I think. Thank you, Gina.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary Beth. Thank you, Natalie and Brandy. I want to thank the whole team for everything you've done to be able to host me here today. I want to begin by acknowledgments. We just passed an Indigenous land acknowledgement at UTEP this past semester, so I'm going to share that. As members of the University of Texas El Paso community, we acknowledge that we are meeting on unceded Indigenous land. We would like to recognize and pay our respects to the Indigenous people with long ties to the immediate region, the Lipan Apache, the Mescalero Apache, the Piro, Manso, Suma, Humano, Isleta del Sur Pueblo, Piro, Manso, Tigua Indian tribe of the Pueblo San Juan de Guadalupe, and Tortugas Pueblo. We also acknowledge the nations whose territories include present-day Texas, the Carrizo and Comecrudo, Coahuiltecan, Cado, Toncagua, Comanche, Alabama, Cushata, Kickapoo, and the peoples of Chihuahua and northern Mexico, from whom most or many of our students here in El Paso descend from, such as Araramuri, Tepehuan, Huixarica, Nahualaca. Finally, we recognize all of the American Indian and Indigenous people and communities who have been or have become part of these lands and territories here in El Paso del Norte, also referred to as Turtle Island. The University of Texas at El Paso honors our history and cultures, and we see greater awareness of the myriad ways in which our legacy can guide us in fruitful partnerships and mutually fulfilling relationships. I would also like to acknowledge farm workers. In the image that you have in front of you, we had farm workers working during the pandemic and during the forest fires in California. And the farm workers, the dairy workers, the meat packing workers, the people working in supermarkets, our food production workers, and primarily have always worked. Many of us had the privilege to stay at home and work from home or study from home. But without farm workers, we don't eat. And so they just couldn't stop working. They had to work and became transition from people that folks wanted to deport to essential workers by designation of Homeland Security. So I acknowledge farm workers, food production workers in our country. And this is also a way of acknowledging my parents as farm workers themselves. So a little bit of the background. I grew up as a child of migrant farm workers born in California, and then we would move every 2 or 3 months. I came to New Mexico as an adult and found the same mobile home we had lived in as migrant farm workers. And 20-some later, the situation, the conditions were very similar. I came and did my research on the political ecology of Hatch, New Mexico. And then later on, I wrote my autoethnography as the preface of my dissertation. And that was one of my first publications as a newly minted PhD. And I had a colleague who questioned, what could I do with my own story and whether I could get tenure with my story. And this story has been shared in classes of 500 students and teacher ed programs to bring awareness of the situations of migrant farm working kids. So I'm very proud of this short story, and I look forward to sharing it with you if you're interested. As an anthropologist working on the U.S. Mexico border since 2000, I was first commissioned to help identify and count hidden and hard to reach populations in southern New Mexico. I joined the University of Texas in El Paso in 2004 as a visiting professor and joined the tenure track in 2005. Once I got tenure, I asked to teach a class I've always wanted to teach, and that's the anthropology of food, gender, culture, and society. So the talk I'm giving you today is based on years of research and my love of learning, and I've learned a lot from my students. In mid-March 2020, we received our stay-at-home orders. With the pandemic, COVID was here. I remember first posting on Facebook, get yourself a sack of rice and beans. And that was one of the first posts I made as I saw people running to the supermarket, stocking up on cans and ramen and toilet paper. And I recalled on my early memories of food insecurity in between the seasonal harvest where my parents were waiting to be called into the fields to harvest new produce. During those times, if farm workers don't work, they don't eat. There was no social security network or unemployment that our farm workers could qualify for at the time. So my parents would stock, harvest rice and beans, and then we would make that work with anything we can get our hands on, protein or fruits and vegetables. So in time of pandemic and crisis, it took me back to my early years of trying to make do. And in 2020, I also had applied and received a grant from the National Association of Hispanic Journalists to reclaim our border narrative. Oftentimes the border is described as a place where there's violence, immigration, usually in very negative ways in national media. But this is a journey to reclaim our stories and tell our stories of people coming together and doing great things. So this is what funded my Border Foodscapes project that I'll be talking about today. During the pandemic, I started to think about meal planning, looking for recipes, sharing them online, looking at recipes that I can make while I was staying at home as a way of mentally staying balanced and staying well, and as a way of nourishing my family. I know that being separated from family and friends, from work, from all things that we used to do has taken a toll on the human psyche. And many of us began to see the overlap of work and family obligations, and it began to weigh heavy on me, particularly as my family was struck by the virus in California and I am in Texas. So there was a physical separation between my loved ones and myself and my family here in El Paso. And then I'm in a state where we have a no mask mandate, where we live in a community with a highly vulnerable majority minority population that is heavily uninsured and overwhelmed as a working class community. And so I was seeing these dichotomies and these desperate ways of trying to figure out how to negotiate the pandemic, particularly in our communities of color. In mid-March, we transitioned to online education, and I began to see and hear my colleagues experience that pressure, right, of transitioning to online and then having to show up in person in the fall of 2020 as if the pandemic was over. But we felt this tremendous pressure to show up to work and be there. And it was really important to be there for our students. But things are not all well yet, and here we are still. So the goals for my talk today is to discuss food as an expression of care and belonging, as critical for building community, and for asserting our identity, who we are, and recreating that through the social relationships we maintain. My talk today will address the topic of food on the U.S. Mexico border under several categories: in the formation of identity, in the expression of our culture, as a form of creating communities of care and reciprocal ties. Food as resistance. This is something that we don't usually think about. How can food be a form of resistance? And how we can engage in politics of food sharing with migrants and refugees during times of anti-immigrant policies and practices. Also, food as a barometer for assessing gender inequality in our households, in our community, in our society, and also gender diversity, because some of the people I've interviewed have been men and gender non-binary identifying individuals. Also, food as a Chicana feminist praxis. For many years or decades, we abandoned food studies as not the feminist thing to do, right? We were trying to integrate into the workforce, enter different fields, and somehow all things associated with the house and domesticity and femininity associated with a household was something that people were moving away from. And for a lot of us, the food and the kitchen and nourishment has never really left our lives. It's always been part of who we are. So I want to reclaim that to be Chicana and to be a sister, a daughter, a friend is for me to think about food and nourishment as a critical part of our identity and the performance of our identity in our relationships. I will share with you a little bit about meal trains, how we create these meal trains to provide nourishment for our family, our friends in need, particularly those who are having babies during a pandemic and don't have family to help them, or don't have baby showers, or people who have the virus or have fallen ill and just don't have people around them. Also, food as an expression of love, concern, and solidarity. And I think when we think about food, we think nourishment, things we like to eat, and we think about if someone loves you, they'll make your favorite meal. So that's something that's there, it's in the background. But also food as a form of accompanying people. This notion of acompañamiento, I'm accompanying you in your grief or in your time of spiritual healing, and I brought you this dish that I thought would help. Right. So this notion of I can't be in your space, you can't be in mine because we're supposed to be socially distancing, and gathering increases our risk of catching the virus. But it doesn't mean we abandon each other. We can still maintain social ties and relationships and do so with food as a vehicle. I'm going to speak to you a little bit about the methodologies. I have used oral histories, participant observation, Zoom video chats, Zoom video cooking sessions. I have posted images of dishes on social media, and we've used technology as a way of reaching out through text, through phone calls, and through the internet for organizing a lot of these meal deliveries. I'm going to introduce you to the part of the world that I'm living in. This is the U.S. Mexico border. These small dots are rural, unincorporated communities. They're outside of big cities. So you see Texas has thousands of these communities, South Texas, but here in this center between New Mexico and Texas, in this little West Coast corner, is El Paso. So this is where I'm speaking to you today. And my research was in Doña Ana County, a little bit north of El Paso, is where I spent years of my life doing my dissertation work, and where my parents had been farm workers while I was growing up. And then my family is over here south of San Diego in the Imperial Valley. So it takes me 10 hours to drive home. I'm relatively close by. So my research in colonias, I came out in 2000, and during my research, I began to witness food as being ubiquitous. It was everywhere, but it was not necessarily the focus of my research at the time. When I came out to New Mexico, I came to understand the human environmental relationships of what did people do when they were stuck in rural areas without paved roads, and it rained and they would get stuck in the mud and they couldn't access their homes or go to work or go to school. The social stigmas of having to walk through mud to get to school, and the type of shaming that went on with kids in the schools. So I came to look at how people organize to be able to request and demand the infrastructure to live a more dignified life. And I witnessed how residents would oftentimes send food over when there was a loss in a different neighbor's home. Someone lost someone, and then all these neighbors would send a meal over. When residents came together and they organized a community cleanup, a community meeting to request and organize or pick up signatures, at the end of those meetings, there was food in the background, and people would bring a dish, and this food would bring people together. So in these spaces, I witnessed people of diverse citizenship status, U.S. citizens, U.S. residents, newly arrived immigrants, people of different professions, coming together. And at the end of the day, what connected them was that they were all sharing a meal together. And each one of them had added something to the table. And at that moment, it didn't matter if you're a US citizen or a newly arrived immigrant. The fact is that you were living in the United States in a community that didn't have paved roads, sewage, and many times piped water. At the county, state, and federal levels, I attended many meetings. And I began to witness professionals who often did not speak to each other. People can be very tribal in their agencies and their organizations and not share information or compete for resources. But then I saw key people in the communities who would bring food to the table, and then everybody had to sit at the table and talk to each other. So before you bring in and pave a road, you need to bring in piped water. So you bring in the water first, then you pave the road. That was not happening during the time of my research. And it didn't make sense. I'm like, why are these folks talking to each other? Well, because we're very territorial and we can be very non-collaborative at times. But there was a woman that worked at the county. She started bringing burritos to the table, and these gentlemen started getting to the table to collaborate. And then you began to see some of these community projects take place. And I'm like, wow, you're building community one burrito at a time. And I thought it was funny. I write it down, and she just kind of looked at me and smirked. But we knew that in those moments, everybody had to eat, right? And they had to collaborate. And I kept that in the back of my mind. Also, I see how food is so significant in a person's regional, state, and our national identities, right? There's these meals that we love, that we want to share with others. In this region, green chili, we add roasted green chili to hamburgers and cheeseburgers and to anything barbecued, or anything we can add green chili to, mac and cheese green chili. Anything you can imagine that we can add green chili, we will add it. And then when you go anywhere else outside of the United States or this region, without chile, we go into like this panic attack, right? Because we're missing that spice that is so wonderful. Also, I saw food as a micro enterprise opportunity for women to complement their salaries, their household incomes. I saw women selling chiles in the back of a truck, driving it up to Colorado, women organizing and having their own pop-up restaurants on weekends. And with that food that they would buy clothing or shoes or take care of an illness or pay for a payment for their truck. So food is micro enterprise. And I said, wow, in these communities, there are no restaurants. There are oftentimes food deserts. No one really has big supermarkets to sell these farm workers food. They are harvesting our food and have very little food to buy because there are no restaurants or big supermarkets. You have to drive into the city. And for some, it involves like 45 miles of having to drive into the city. And that requires you have good transportation. Also in this part of the world, we have the Hatch Chile Festival. It's always around Labor Day weekend, early September. And you have people come in their SUVs, in their RVs. People drive hundreds of miles with their ice chest to pack in their green chili. And then people buy an extra cooler or an extra freezer in their garage, and you have green chili the whole year. So this is so addictive that people drive hundreds of miles to get it. So here I'm going to introduce you to Estrella. This is a pseudonym she chose to be called Estrella, which translates into star. And she was having a community meeting. And if you see in the background, there's food, but on the right-hand side corner, you can see a lady. That was Estrella's mother. And when I asked Estrella, why do you organize? Why are you community leader? Like, what makes you want to organize your neighbors? And she says, look, I have water, I have wastewater, but my parents are elderly. They are my neighbors. They are still not connected to the grid, right? They still have a septic tank. And every time it rains, it overflows. And the smell of human waste is horrible. And the kids can't play outside. So she says, I will be hustling. I will go to meetings. I will be hated by everybody, but I need to do what I need to do to make sure that the rest of my community is taken care of, especially my parents. And so this is a family that took me in. I see them as, I'm very grateful because the elders kind of gave the heads up. They nodded. And when people started asking who I was, why was I asking all these questions? It was the elders who said, you know, she's a good kid. My wife likes her. My mother is okay. I was approved by the elders, and they kind of gave me the green light to then do more household ethnographies. And what I had planned to be a 1-year stint in New Mexico became 3 years of research, applied research, after seeing people living in these conditions, like developing countries. I was very bothered, and I asked myself, what could I do as a student? Who would listen to me? So I began to bring people from different agencies to come see what I was seeing. And then I'm not a counselor or social worker, but I started inviting these professionals to come and do what was possible within their funding agencies and capacities to help bring resources to these communities. And then I never left the region. This is the famous New Mexican Red Chile. These are known as ristras, or they're like braided chile. And I have a quote, La vida sin chile no es vida. Life without chile is not life, right? And I say this tongue in cheek, but when you have chile in your life, then you like it, you incorporate it into different meals. And when I travel, I pack it into my suitcase. So Homeland Security will always go through my suitcase. They always leave me a notice that they've inspected, but I actually travel with chile. And then when I arrive, people will they'll ask me, what suitcase is the chile in? What will you make for us today? So I think this is hilarious because if I can drive, I'll drive because I can take more chile with me, right? And then I divide it with my family, friends, and they all want some chile from New Mexico. So I'm going to bring you into the most recent timeline of my research. Before the pandemic, here in the El Paso border region, we were organizing to fix meals for migrants and refugees. Many of these refugees were held in private detention facilities. And there were times where I think they got overwhelmed, or the facilities would get filled, or people started getting sick, and nobody wants people to die under their care. And as horrible as it sounds, every once in a while you just see 150 people released into the streets of El Paso. And they come from Honduras, Guatemala, and they don't know, what am I doing here? What, now that we've been released, where are we supposed to go? And I remember these incidences of 100 and some people being released at the local Greyhound. And the local communities just saying, there's all these people at a Greyhound. They don't know the geography, they don't know English. Why was this done, right? And so as a civil community, as a civil society, people started coming together, trying to get a nonprofit to come in and shepherd people to shelter. This is important because we have human trafficking, and we have people who are held against their will for ransom. And human trafficking is a very real phenomena. So having migrants, refugees wandering a city, not knowing where to go, who can help them, is putting additional risks in their future. So getting migrants and refugees to a shelter, and then the shelters were overwhelmed, and then organizations started renting motel rooms. But many of these motel rooms had no kitchens. So how would you feed 150 people that were just released into the streets? And I saw how beautiful this community of El Paso came to, started forming groups. So one group or one faith community took care of a Monday, another one a Tuesday, another a Wednesday. And some of the people I've interviewed, we become friends because that's how we met, serving meals for migrants and refugees. So during the previous presidential administration, immigrants were being released, and then they closed the border, and then immigrants were being allowed to stay in Mexico, right? They had to remain in Mexico. So that became a whole social phenomena. And then the virus kicked in as well. So 2019, a lot of migrants and refugees were being released, and people were organizing meals of 150 meals. So just trying to prepare a meal for 150 people when most of us are not experts in restaurants and catering and providing such big meals. 2020, we had the COVID pandemic hit, and then we had to figure out how to nourish ourselves, how to avoid infection, how to survive before vaccines. So it was like survival mode. And then vaccines came, and now we're looking at food for healing, for nourishing, food as medicine, for caring for each other, for rebuilding, for getting back on our feet. So this is a brief timeline on where I'm at. So this is a sopita. I don't know if you can see this and look at it. What can you see? You can see a little bowl of maybe vermicelli, yes. So this is a sopita. It's a very common, typical Mexican comfort food made with a tomato broth with onion and garlic, tomato sauce or real tomatoes that you can blend in a blender. But recently I went to visit a friend who had lost her elder. And so she said, I just lost my only elder left, and we're alone now. We don't have any elders in my family. And then I visited her in the morning, and before I knew it, I heard sniffles. And I said, are you okay? And she says, I'm okay, I'm okay. And she just kind of tapped me, I'm okay, I'm okay. And then I said, what's going on? And she says, last night I dreamt of my grandmother. Every time someone died, my grandmother would send them this soup, una sopita de fideo. She would send a big old pot of fideo. And last night I dreamt of my grandmother, and I saw all my elders who had passed, my parents, my aunts, my uncles, my grandmother, and they were all having this soup. They were all sitting at a table, and I came close to the table, and my grandmother said, it's not your time, Gordis. It's not your time, hija. Get away from the table. And I said, Grandma, but I'm hungry. Please give me some sopita. And the grandmother said, it's not your time. I cannot serve you yet. Go. And so when I knocked at her door and I showed up with a big Tupperware of sopita, she was stunned. And I didn't catch it at first. I just heard a, and I said, oh, I hope she likes it. I hope, because it's very humble food. So I said, oh, maybe she wanted something else, or I didn't know. It was until I heard her crying that she said, my grandmother sent you. And I said, you know, I don't know your grandma. I didn't get a phone call. She didn't ask me to come. She's like, no, my grandma's already passed. But I wanted this soup and she wouldn't let me get to the table with my ancestors. It was not my time yet. But she knows I have friends and you have come on behalf of my grandmother to deliver the soup. And now I associate this soup with the food of grieving, of someone who has lost a loved one. Very recently, one of my colleagues lost her sister to COVID. We organized meals. She's got 4 children. And then this is the only thing I can think of. I said, I'm going to make, she has 4 kids. I'm going to make sandwiches that have vegetables, some fruit, something sweet, but I'm going to make some sopita. And then I get a call, I get a text, and she says, this was my sister's favorite soup. I can't function, right? She sleeps because she's in some deep, deep grief. Her only sister is no longer here. And then I show up to her house with this bowl, the big old container of sopa. And I said, this is all I can think of. I don't know what else I can make you. I can't think of anything gourmet or anything fancy, but this, you have kids and I think it's cold and they'll enjoy this during winter. So I want to share with you the power of story, the power of food, the power of love and friendship, and how food can comfort us during these very difficult times. So I'm going to share a little bit of one of the first times that we were invited to organize meals for migrants and refugees here in the border. I think it was winter 2017. And I was invited by a colleague. They were going to serve 150 people outside of a motel room in the winter. People were sick. They were not dressed for the winter. They were being released into the street. I saw children who were sick and they had stuff on their face and their hair and their teeth were messed up from years of malnourishment. And the first thing I can think of is I make a black bean and corn salad with onions, tomatoes, and cilantro and olive oil and lemon. And so I took just containers and containers, aluminum containers of this black bean and corn salad. And I associated this with something familiar that whether you're an adult or a child, you would be able to recognize the black beans and the corn from the salad. But what really struck me is that someone thought it would be a good idea to serve migrants and refugees kale salad or kale. And I just kept on seeing bags and bags of kale. And I just was so perplexed and overwhelmed of who would have thought of bringing kale. It's a superfood. Maybe we love it. I have a love-hate relationship with it because it's hard. But you need to know how to prepare it with some sort of citrus to make it softer or to massage it. Now I've learned to massage the kale. But if you're not a foodie, most of us did not grow up with kale. But I had a friend, she was also an immigrant. She decided to convert these igloo containers into soup containers. I never thought of an igloo container as a soup container. I've seen them with lemonade, water, and Gatorade at games. But she thought, you know, these are folks, they're coming from Central America. It's the winter and they've just been released into the streets. I'm going to make 2 igloos of chicken soup with vegetables and rice. And I would hear the kids say, it's sopita, it's good, it's warm, and just bringing it to their mouths and to their faces and just slurping it. And then one kid came and asked for more bean salad. And another kid came and said, what is this? ¿Qué es esto? Está muy duro. You know, it's so hard. And they were referring to the kale, right? And I was just so overwhelmed. Who the hell brought kale to the table? And I was just so like judgmental. I was so upset. I was overwhelmed. And just, I think, you know, everybody's trying to give the best they can. And it was just this real like mirror reflection of the haves and the have-nots, of the good thinking Americans, and we want to help people, but just not being aware that these folks just came thousands of miles from Central America through Mexico, through a desert, were detained, and now, you know, have been in detention for a while and been released. And they thought of giving them this hard kale. And then later on, I interviewed a young man who saw organizing these meals as a form of resistance. And that's where this notion of food as resistance comes in. When we're living in a state where the immigrant is treated as the other, as the enemy of the state, and local residents come. And this was a young queer man who had never grown up cooking in his life, right? His mom who would prepare his meals, but he moved out, got a job, and started working at an Italian restaurant. So he learned to cook Italian food before he cooked Mexican food. But he thought, how will I provide meal and nourishment to 100 people at a time? He went to the Mexican market, got some ingredients, and packaged big sandwiches. And then as people started seeing that he was feeding migrants, and that he was an artist, he didn't have a lot of money, his friends and the artist community and the communities of conscious started saying, I'll help you. Let's make this food. I'll help you. So I write this story up in serving meals for Central American refugees. Denise Chavez is a Chicana writer and playwright of New Mexico. She's organizing this collection of stories of serving migrants on the journey. Then food in the food city. I want to introduce you to the food of the border region. El Paso is this western tip of Texas, as I've shared with you on the map, and it borders with Mexico and the state of New Mexico. So it's known for having great Mexican food. So this is like a commercial. Come and visit us. I think I should do food tours, because when friends come in, they always want to go eat and they're like, take us to the best places. And that's like now like my hobby. I think I should make it into a part-time job and just do food tours. But this region blends the Texas beef culture, the Texas beef brisket with the New Mexican green chili, the red chili, Mexican flavors and ingredients. People cross the border, they go to markets, they bring cheeses, chiles, spices. So there's this amazing fusion of food and culture in this region. And people really identify with the food of this region. And this identifies us. There's these certain, if you say Chicos Tacos and you're from El Paso, people, it's this horrible nostalgia of food that people ate while they were growing up, and they miss it because no one else makes this type of food. So food connects us across borders and language. We use Chihuahua cheese. It's a great white meltable cheese. But then here people make chile con queso, or they just say queso. Like, do you want some queso? And I'm like, that means cheese. You're gonna give me cheese with what? But it's usually a dip, right? For chips, chile con queso, or a dip with green chili and white cheddar. And it's fantastic. There's different types of chile con quesos that you can order at different restaurants. We also have pecan. So the pecan is very important for this region, for other parts of Texas. The chile, the green chili, the red chili. The tortillas, we have flour tortillas, corn tortillas, tacos or burritos, or a whole different combination of dishes you can make. But we're also in the United States. So we have hamburgers and cheeseburgers, and we add green chili to them. We have hot dogs, and we add onions and tomatoes and chile to our hot dogs and wrap them in bacon, right? It's a border hot dog. It's amazing. And then, of course, this is cattle culture, from Mexican cowboy, Chihuahua vaqueros, to the Texan, New Mexican cowboy cattle culture, steak, brisket, ribs, any celebration, people will serve you brisket. And then you can have barbecue, or you can have red chili to go with that brisket, and then all these type of side items that can go. So I'm sorry for making you very hungry. I hope I can entice you to come visit me. And of course, images would have been wonderful, but then I think it would have been too much for me to be slobbering and giving you a talk. So when people come to the border and they want to talk about the border, it's very common to have reporters or folks say, can I talk to you about the border? Can I interview you about the border, the culture, the food, the people? I'll usually say yes. So I've done several interviews as a professor, as a scholar, but right before it was a winter, I got a call and says, someone would like to interview about border cuisine. I said, okay. And they said, well, they're going to come and visit with you. I said, all right. And so I had a pre-interview. Then later on, they're like, do you know who's interviewing you? I said, no, I don't watch a lot of TV. I'm a big nerd. I don't watch a lot of TV. They said, this is Padma Lakshmi from Top Chef, and she wants to talk to you. And I said, oh, okay. They sent me 2 links, and then I was like, oh, Top Chef, that's big, right? And so here we are with Padma Lakshmi walking through El Paso, identifying the best burritos in town, and talking about the portability of this meal, but also the working class background. And then there's debates of where the burrito emerged, whether it's Sonora or Chihuahua. But burritos are these small portable meals that you can wrap into a tortilla. And I would argue that different cultures have different burritos. They just call the flatbread by different names. But this gave me an opportunity to do participant observation. We hit the town with my students and we said, okay, let's go try the best burritos in town. So when these folks come from New York City, we know where to take them. And then this just showing up on Hulu has had millions of views. I have gotten calls, emails from all over the world, but a lot of my former students connected with me, and it just, got me invited into different panels and different settings to talk about food and mental health, food and community, food and identity, just food and fusion of cultures and identity and language. And so I just wanted to put this here because it was just such a momentous event in my career, just taking food public, taking it to the screen, having my family know what the hell I'm doing here. Right? They asked me, you came out to New Mexico to El Paso. Are you done with your research yet? And you can never be done with this research. And it still has me here. So during the pandemic, as we were going through this, the question of what will I feed my family today? I don't know how many of you can relate to this question. We're all at home. People are looking at you. These food decisions, there's a lot of this gendered labor that's unrecognized. It's just expected, right? What's for lunch? What's for dinner? As if we are in the time of the Jetsons and I can just like put in a code and there's like a whole meal. When many of us were working from home, many times we had meetings or classes at 11, at 12, at 1. I'm at work, but the expectation to have full meals prepared was still there. And if you don't plan or have basic ingredients at home, this decision of what will I make for my family becomes a complicated issue. When you have family members, in my case, from different cultures, different religions, my husband is North African, I'm Mexican American, he's North African, he's Muslim, I am not. There's things he needs to eat that are halal, things I don't think about those things all the time, but now I have to think about all these things. These simple questions of what will I feed my family become these really complicated questions that brings anxiety and angst, because somehow I'm supposed to have all this planned out and get it together. And these notions of femininity and being a good mom, a good spouse, a good person that cares for others, it's complicated when you're trying to do your job and provide for your family as well. So this reality of women and caretakers, right, working from home, homeschooling children, trying to balance the emotional labor of domestic duties and these gendered expectations. I want us to talk about this because I want to call for us to redefine these gender norms and expectations, to challenge our family members and say, this is the way we're raised, but it's not very realistic when we have so many women in the workforce. We've been working for a long time. It's not new, but somehow everything in the pandemic just brought it all together at the household level. And this constant pressure to produce at home and work and lead efforts, right, has really pushed women out of their careers. And these pressures are now referred to as the great she session. How many women have left their careers because trying to do their work, homeschool their kids, provide for their families, nourish their families, care for their families, care for the ill, has been really devastating for so many women in our country. And now for more people, this is now referred to as a great resignation. People are just stepping away from their careers altogether, saying, I just can't do this anymore. I'm done. So I wrote this piece, What Will I Feed My Family? Food Decisions During COVID-19 on the U.S. Mexico Border in Gastronomica, which is a food journal. And that for me was like, okay, I'm writing about food, everyday life. We all think about this, but we don't always write about it. So how do we care for each other via food? I want you to think about all the different examples when someone brought you a meal, when you dropped a meal somewhere else, or when you covered someone, when someone doesn't have money and says, I just can't pay for it. I've got you. But what are the social, ethical, and political obligations to reciprocate? Why do we provide food to others that might or might not be related to us? Of course, when they're your kids, you say, okay, I have to feed my children or my family. But beyond the immediate family and friends, what motivates people to provide for others? Right? Many times people took to technology to try to communicate out, let us know that someone was sick, letting us know that someone was not doing well, letting us know that someone was feeling anxious and depressed. So social media played a critical role in connecting us, right? The video calls, the texts, the social media posts. And knowing when someone had a baby, someone was pregnant during the pandemic, they were probably not going to have a baby shower. Knowing that someone had fallen ill, knowing that someone had lost a parent, a partner, knowing that someone was struggling with isolation, we began to organize meal drop-offs. And of course, we were all stressed, trying not to get to the supermarket. People would buy oftentimes food for a month or every 2 weeks, or they would buy produce and then they try to use everything. So after the first week or two, they were no longer eating fresh produce. And trying to make do with what we had in our pantries. Of course, some people have more privilege than others. In low-income communities, people usually buy what they can afford. In middle class and upper class, people can go and buy bulk and just take everything they can afford to carry. But I would go into Mexican supermarkets, and besides the pasta and the tomato paste, there was still food on the shelves. And I had conversations with clerks, and they would say, you know why we still have food? Because we can't afford to buy everything like rich people do. And I just constantly was engaged in this kind of dialogue of class and accessibility and being very mindful of the haves and not the have-nots in our community, right? And this became a challenge to turn to each other and say, what can I do with what I have? How do you prepare, a meal with these vegetables that someone has gifted me? People started calling home, Mom, how do I make this? Or what did you make today? Because I can't even think about what I'm going to prepare for my family. Some of us took on to video calls and say, how do you make that? Can you share it with me? I never learned how to make it. We also became much more aware of the elderly, right? The vulnerable populations experiencing homelessness who might benefit from a meal. And the interviews I did in my oral histories, I document what motivates a young man to get on his bike and find out who's homeless in his vicinity and provide a meal and drop them off. And how other people say, what are you doing? I drop off meals to people experiencing homelessness. Well, I'll help you. And how that kind of had a chain reaction of people caring for others. So this is a piece that it took me a year to write. It was always very kind of autobiographical by time, food and caring during the times of COVID on the U.S. Mexico border. And this is going to be published by Rutgers University Press, and the editors are Harry Kashdan and Philip Leisner. And we now have a title for the book. It's called Lockdown in the Kitchen. And this is gathering stories from folks all over the United States of how they're navigating the pandemic. So food distribution during COVID. I want you to think about the political economy, right, of these decisions, not just making a meal and dropping it off, but you have to think about certain questions that inform the planning, the preparation, the distribution decisions. Many of us will connect with people in our immediate neighborhood. Who do I know around my neighborhood who would appreciate what I made? Because just because you made it doesn't mean people are going to eat it or like it or appreciate it. Or who lives alone that is probably not cooking these big elaborate meals. And if I make enough, I can package Tupperware or recycle plasticware and drop it off. Who's experiencing depression? Many times people will post, I'm just not doing well. I lost so-and-so, I'm not functioning. Or people with anxiety, or people with limited mobility. Someone who doesn't have a car cannot get to a supermarket. We also have the digital divide. Not everybody can just order One Grub or the Grubhub or the whatever DoorDash or order online and just swing by and have people deliver the meal into your car at home. There's different types of mobility, economic and physical mobility. Not having a vehicle really complicated people's lives during the pandemic. And then also, I was very mindful of who else is taking precautions, because seeing people going to parties and all that, it's just, they were taking risks, right? And I have a child with special needs and has had many surgeries, and I just couldn't engage with a lot of folks that I would see were not really taking this seriously or not wearing the mask or social distancing. So if I was going to engage in these kind of interactions, I really wanted to be mindful of respecting people's decision to stay at home and to not socially interact with others. So the act of dropping off or sending a dish to a person in need is not necessarily new. I think people could argue, oh, we do that. My faith community does that, or my people do that. But I think, having people visit your home during this time became a threat to people's personal and family's health. So it wasn't so easy. These social gatherings were complicated. They were not so common in everyday life prior to the pandemic. I would argue that dropping off food became the antithesis for social gatherings, for feasts, for family dinners. It became a solution to building communities of care without putting additional risk on people. When I knew I was preparing a dish for someone in need, I would wear a mask, right? I would drop it off to avoid social contact. I would put it in front of their doors, on top of a table, on top of just anything that I could put food on top of. And then I would text them and say, there's food in front of your house. Are you home? Before I would drop it off, will you be home? And these were strategies for letting people know that you cared about them, that you were thinking about them. These were strategies for strengthening these social networks, for creating safety nets, for making sure that elders were not dying alone. And, for our older adult community, it was not just COVID, but it was social isolation. It was sadness taking a toll on our folks. And then, of course, if someone brings you food and you bring on food to someone else, it contributes to these stronger relationships. It's harder to be mad at someone who took the time to prepare a meal for you and your family when your family was sick, right? And so these ties that bind, these communities of care have evolved because now you have all these multiple communities that you're a part of and that you're engaged in, and we're creating these safety nets in our community. So I want to share with you a little bit. I'm writing a chapter on meal trains as a feminist praxis. Meal trains, there's a website, many of you might have used them already. It's a way for signing up and say, I will bring a meal on this day at this time. And then the person in need will identify their address, what they eat, their food preferences, how many people are in their family, if they have allergies or not. And so it allows us to care for each other, lift each other up, help each other when one is down and out, and it allows us to do it through technology. Of course, not everybody has technology. I've done meal trains. I've seen them. The first time I saw them, it was an Algerian American who was organizing meal trains for her sister. This was her second child, and she was going to go through a C-section. She organized a meal train for 40 days, right? And in different cultures, we call it la cuarentena, having a baby and then not doing very much for 40 days to allow your body to heal and to spend time with your child, to bond. So having an entire community take care of you. And imagine if more women had this in their lives, and more families had folks willing to come together and nurture you, right? But when we have individualized culture or society where that's away from their families and friends, you don't always have people who might be able to provide you a meal for a week or 2 weeks, let alone 40 days. So I learned this from the Algerian, North African Muslim sisters in Las Cruces. And then here in El Paso, I want to share the story of Carla. She had her second baby. She comes from Sonora, from a different part of the border. Besides her spouse, she had no other family in town. So when we knew that Carla was having a baby, it was a lot of her friends and other moms of infants and toddlers who said, look, she has no family here, right? Her partner doesn't cook much, and she's gonna now have 2 babies at home. Can we organize a meal train? And people start to organize drop-off times and dates to bring dishes to her home, and also gifts for the baby because she couldn't do a baby shower. So now Carla, I can call her and say, Carla, this person's having a baby. And she's like, I'm on it. Because she's so appreciative that someone did this to her during her time of need, that she's now part of this meal train web of care. Katrina had a baby. Some of her friends and colleagues organized a meal train, drop off food at her home. I dropped off caldo de pollo, chicken soup with chunks of vegetable, and a Mexican red rice. Later on, I learned that almost everybody else had dropped off pasta, and Katrina was like, I'm sick of pasta. Please don't bring me more pasta. So it's not always perfect. Sometimes people are well-intentioned, but things don't always work out. So you have to be mindful of people's dietary needs. Hilda recently, her family got COVID. And then I thought, when I said, how are you doing? She said, I cannot function. I have headaches, I have migraines. I can't even get up to feed my kids. So immediately I made a list of feminist scholars in my community. And I said, we have a feminist scholar who's down. She's got 4 kids and cannot feed them. Can you please set up, are you willing to provide a meal? And people who had never met her made beautiful meals for her. So Hilda remembers, just eating a meal and crying and crying and crying. And I said, are you okay? Was it offensive? Was it something? She says, they don't know me. They don't know my children. They don't know I'm queer. They don't know that my whole family has abandoned me. And yet you all came through for me. Who are these women? How will I thank them? Because they don't even know me. And they have fed my children and myself and my partner. And I'm forever indebted. And now Hilda reflected in her interview how she learned of a classmate that she went to high school with that now has breast cancer and lives in a different city in Houston. And now she signed up to send her a meal. So when someone has given to you, now this creates this like a reciprocal obligation to now begin to take care of others. I'm going to share a little story of pomegranates. I love pomegranates. They're known as granadas in Spanish. I have a recently retired colleague, and she has a sister that moved in to El Paso, bought a house that already had full-grown pomegranate trees. So this friend texted me and said, listen, do you want some pomegranates? Come to my house and pick them up. And she had this huge Ziploc bag, like to pack blankets or something. And they were filled with pomegranates. And I was like, what do I do with all these? So I remember there was a presidential debate in the background in my vehicle. And I began to think, who would benefit from pomegranates? And I started to think of all the friends. I had kids, and I started to like drop them off in their homes and just knock and then leave, and or send them a text. I just dropped off pomegranates at your house. Pomegranates are really, really popular in this region around September because they're used in this beautiful dish called chiles en nogada. It's chiles, stuffed poblano chiles with a meat dish that has spices and nuts and dried fruit. And then they have a pecan or a walnut based cream sauce that goes on top. And then they put pomegranates on top. So they're a very elaborate dish, and it's used around September to commemorate Mexican Independence Day. So having pomegranates during this time is like you hit gold, right? Because a lot of people can't make that dish if they don't have this fruit. And people will just buy it all up at the store. So what began as this change of fruit actually triggered a chain reaction of people dropping off figs at my house, cucumbers, tomatoes, or anything extra that they had, right? And we began to engage in these reciprocal ties and strengthening of our networks. And then of course my husband was like, who brings food to your house? Why are people dropping off produce? Not knowing that this was probably my doing, because I was constantly engaged in this, like, someone gifted me all this. I cannot eat all these pomegranates. I'm going to drop them off. Right. But it also, I have to be very honest with you, as part of my mental health care, I couldn't just be home all day cooking and working. Being able to drop something off would give me a sense of euphoria, of joy, of just like, I got out today, I did something kind for someone. And I knew they had kids, or not everybody has transportation. But what led to more people dropping off things and saying, I have a fig tree, I have this tree, or someone brought me all these tomatoes, I cannot eat all these tomatoes, and just dropping things off. And this amazing invisible web of life began to take place. So I'm going to pause for a minute, and I'm going to ask you to rethink, what are some traditional family recipes that you would like to reclaim? What memories do you have of the meals that someone that loved you made for you that maybe you never learned to make? And I'm saying this because this is an assignment I give my students, and when I give a talk, of reclaiming our traditional food ways, of decolonizing the foods we eat. Because a lot of the foods that are processed and frozen and filled with chemicals are not doing a lot of good for our bodies. A lot of our communities of color are underinsured, low income, working class, and having our limited incomes going to processed food that makes us not feel so good takes a toll on the body, right? We have high incidences of obesity and diabetes and high blood pressure in our communities. So my call, my ask of you is to go back and think about your favorite meals. Think of your homeland. What meals connect you to your roots, to the places where you have lived, the places you have traveled, where you just tried this amazing dish and you want to recreate it. But because we're in the pandemic, I think so much is invested in not wasting, or not taking too many risks, because people were early in the pandemic, were trying to gather food and not go to the supermarket too often for fear of getting infected. So the pandemic kept us at home. We weren't eating out in restaurants anymore. We were not hanging out with our family and friends in large social gatherings. And this really kind of took us kind of into this toll of, I'm tired of eating the same thing. What can I make, right? And people calling home, or calling their friends, or calling their aunts, or calling friends and say, friend, do you know how to make this? How do I make this? And of course, there's a little bit of ego involved, because maybe we're very good at our work, but it doesn't mean I'm Betty Crocker. I'm not much of a baker. I can cook things and throw things together, and I see cooking as an art. But baking is a much more methodical. It's chemistry, it's combination of ingredients and timing and quantities, or it doesn't rise, or it doesn't come out, it doesn't taste the way it's supposed to. So I'm very honest. There's things I just don't venture to do, because I don't want to waste all these great ingredients, like pastries and with nuts. Those are expensive, and that's not my thing. I want to learn to make them, but I'm not there yet. So some people organize social pods, while others just could not afford to engage with others. And so they were trying to make do from home, using phones, text, YouTube videos, TikTok videos, Some of the folks that I interviewed started taking to TikTok because you can actually share a recipe in a minute as opposed to 35 minutes or 15 minutes on YouTube. Those who can call on family and friends for help did. Others were impacted by the digital divide. So I continue to talk about this digital divide because it really made a difference, particularly amongst our elders who don't have technology like many of us do every day, who needed the technology to register for the vaccines, who just might have a phone, but not necessarily a smartphone, or not have video, or not know how to use apps to be able to access services. So we turned to each other. We sought our families and our communities to seek comfort, to seek healing through our food. So at this moment, I'm going to pause myself and invite you to just brainstorm. What meal do you want to learn to make? What meal are you particularly proud of that you would love to share with others? As I've learned of people losing their grandparents, their elders, I've seen the post of my grandma passed. Nobody got into the kitchen and asked her how she made her chile verde, how she made this one dish that we all loved eating. If you didn't bother to go into the kitchen with her and learn to make it and prepare it, there's a sensory knowledge. Anthropologists talk about this, right? There's a way of knowing and making sense of the world through our senses. And over time in history and space, our senses have shifted in terms of what we prioritized. Flavor versus the aesthetic, texture. In the United States, things are big, right? In other countries, a lot of food is not as big as the United States. Maybe they privilege not having chemicals in their food, so their food is smaller, but very tasty. So I want you to think about this. This is an invitation to reclaim your traditional foodways, to decolonize your diets, to go back to our traditional foods that nourish our bodies, that our bodies can break down. To really think about how can we use food to build relationships, to build trust, to accompany someone, to comfort and heal in times of crisis or in times of needs or in everyday life. The kitchen is there. It's time to democratize the kitchen. I don't see signs that say women only. This is an opportunity to have conversations with your families about sharing the responsibilities of food work, of care work with others, and to gather those stories. And you can do it now if you're vaccinated with social distancing. You can do it through Zoom and record. You can videotape someone preparing a meal. There's many creative ways of using technology and different methodologies for gathering food stories. So as I'm getting ready to close for our Q&A session, I want you to think of food as a way of identifying and reclaiming our culture, of connecting with our ancestors, of reclaiming our traditional foodways and decolonizing our traditions to restore a notion of wellness again, right? We have already gone through a lot. It's time to heal. How can we use our foodways to heal, to connect with others? How can we use food as a form of resistance in times of anti-immigrant, anti-other, keeping the other out to try to keep us safe? We can provide meals to those in need. We can provide meals as medicina, as nourishment, as medicine for nourishing our bodies and healing our bodies, our minds, and our souls. Food as building solidarity and social networks. Food as mental health and respite, getting out of our home, doing something kind for others, and taking time to breathe and be recognizing of the fact that we are alive, that we've made it this far, to be mindful of what is before us. Food as an invitation to dig into our own family food stories and the gathering of sensory memories. We have lost a lot every time we lose a member of our family. If we never took the time to document those meals that brought us together, they gave us a sense of place, of identity, a notion of love, of fulfillment. Food as an invitation for creativity and self-expression and letting go of ego so that we can explore the kitchen, the cooking, the baking, the chopping, the raw food, the cooked food, the transformed food, the shared food across borders. It's time. here are some resources, some citations if you're interested. Our talk is being recorded, and I'm glad to share what we have. So we're now open for Q&A. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Gina. That was absolutely beautiful. And I have to say that just listening to your voice is made my I'm not a high stress person, but I have to say it made even my stress levels go like way, way down, which was really lovely. I will say that I'm very hungry right now, but I'm sure I think that was part of your intention. So we do have a number of questions, and I did want to say one thing is I'm so glad that you talked about, like, our elders. And I think, my mom is 91, and I just was thinking about how whenever I call her, even though she's older, she always says, well, today, this is what I made today. And she's always making some elaborate meal. Meanwhile, I'm thinking, you're 91, what are you doing? But in so many ways, that makes her feel like she has this purpose, and which to me, she has a million purposes, right? But I think it just makes her feel really important within her, she lives with my sister. So you just made me think a lot about my mom and what she cooks and all my favorite meals that she cooks and why those are so important. And so thank you. And I'm going to start with some questions. Are you ready?
Yes, come on.
All right. So the first question, and I apologize to Blanca because I may, I'm just going to say that I may not pronounce this word properly, but Gina, hopefully you'll help me. I think this is a great question. She says, is the cuarentena after giving birth predominantly a Mexican or Hispanic tradition? And I apologize if I mispronounced that word.
So the notion of quarantine, cuarentena, it's the notion of 40.
Okay.
Right. So this is, I think meeting a North African family in the border and knowing that they also had the 40 days. It's actually old world traditions that carry through from the Moors to the Spanish to the Americas. And this is what's so beautiful across borders is that you do that too, right? The notion of caring for the body, caring for the woman for 40 days for her to heal, for her to bond with her child, for her not to worry about caring for others, so that she can invest in this time for caring for herself and her baby, the most immediate need. So it's not a Mexican tradition. It's not something just ours. It's something we share with others, but also it allows for you to breastfeed, right? And breast milk is super important for building immunity. And during the pandemic, I think the people with children and infants, those folks were the most at stress because there's still no vaccine for babies for 0 to 5, right? So 5 to 11, now you can get a vaccine, but those are the faculty, the students, the colleagues are there. I can't get sick. I can't afford to go out and get sick because my kids don't have a vaccine. If I get sick, I will have killed my kids. I mean, that sounds extreme, but those are the conversations that women were having during this pandemic. So it's not just a Mexican thing. I think it's critical for so many levels of breastfeeding, bonding with your child. And then I was thinking of how can we make this into a feminist praxis, right? Where when we know someone's having a baby, we sign up. And if we sign up 5 women or 7 women once a week, we can take care of a month. And if I just prepare one meal, and I usually sign up for Saturday or Sundays because I work during the week, but I'll say, I'll bring something. And it gives me time to plan. And what do you like? And you have kids, Chile, no Chile, I'll make something spicier, put spice on the side. But it's this ability to lift people up and help people become nourished and bond. And then it's a way of building relationships for the future. And I just think if more of us engage in these ties that bind, ties that nurture, ties that allow people to heal, especially when someone's had a C-section. And for anyone who's read about maternal health in Texas, Texas has had very high maternal health problems, lots of deaths of women dying when they're having childbirth. And for some reasons, right, we're still exploring the debates about that. But if you have your community helping to care for you, especially if you don't have family, many of us move for a career. So we're not surrounded by family all the time. And that creates certain risks. Thank you for that question, Monica.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. It reminds me, one of our staff members at the Institute, core, is from Liberia, and we were talking with some of our new mothers. We have two new mothers, who had COVID babies, and she was talking about how in her country, the women would surround the woman who had the baby and take care of all her needs and cook for her and take care of all of the things, that needed to be done so that she could recover and to get healthy again, right? And food was a part of that. So it seems like lots of cultures have that, which is really cool.
Absolutely. And the notion of food, liquid foods, like my mom would say, drink the caldo, drink the soup, drink my water, drink the milk, because you're producing milk. So you
Mm,
need a lot of liquids to produce milk, right? So all these things, and some people can draw milk, sometimes they can't. And it gets complicated. And when you have to think about, I have to try to feed this baby, there's no manual, you can read all the how to have a baby kind of stuff, but when you're it and you're in the room and nobody else can come into your house because you fear someone carrying the
yeah,
virus affecting your baby. So you're alone. So much postpartum depression that I became aware of, that I'm like, wow, that person's hurting and they're alone and we
yeah,
can't go comfort. We can't hold the baby so she can shower, sleep we couldn't. I mean, people would wear the mask, but unless you have those really tight pods and you trusted that people will not engage with others, it was just a risk that many women couldn't afford to take.
yeah. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So another question from Miranda. Have you recorded strategies in your research that help ease the stress of meal preparation and divide this task among family members?
Yeah, I think this is the challenge, right? Because I see people who have like perfect pantries and everything's labeled and they have these charts. And I think we can all chart something, and that's a great idea of meal planning. But then you create this meal and your kids are like, I don't want that. Who's going to eat it? It sounds great on paper, but then sometimes the kids, like if you have children that don't want the tomato paste, someone wants pasta, someone wants meat, someone just doesn't eat this. Sometimes they just want chicken nuggets, and you're like, oh. So yes, I've seen meal planning. I obsess. I have to say I obsess about meal planning and what am I going to make. And then I later on, once the vaccines were around, I ran into a colleague who said, I see your posts and they're like my guiding posts. There are like my recommendation when I'm wondering, what the hell am I going to make for my parents? She left the region to care for her elderly parents in South Texas. And she's like, I'm not a cook. She was a professional reporter. And she's like, I have to care for elders and I don't cook. And then you post something, you're like, all right, I know how to do that. I know how to do that. I can make that. She's like, you had no idea. Cheerleader, my motivator, I just think about the power of visuals. I remember going to a Chinese restaurant in Chicago. They had 500 items on their menu. And I turned around and I said, do you have anything with pictures? Because I do not read Chinese, right? And they pop out this huge book with pictures. I'm like, yes, right? So now I'll take a picture. And if people want the recipe, they're like, okay, give me the recipe of that one that you posted. Like that one looks good. I can make that one. I think I can make that one. Or I can make a version of that. But for a lot of people, they're like, that's just like a mystery dish. Like, I don't even know how you make stuff like that. I'm not even going to try. But by posting the pictures, it's the senses like, okay, sensory memory. I think I can make that. And I think my elderly parents who have diabetes can eat it. And she's like, you have no idea how often I would just emulate everything you make. Right. And then I started just keeping the pictures, and that would just kind of keep a memory of what I could do. Because when you're tired, fatigued, or lost someone, you're just not thinking the way you would in every other day outside of this situation that we've been living in. So yeah, I look at meal planning. I have a binder. I have like my binder of different meals, and people give me recipes, and I'm like, that's a great recipe. My kid would never eat that, right? Because families are complex. I cannot deliver a meal plan for you hoping you'll like it, because I have to know what your family eats. How old are your kids? Your partner? What kind of dietary restrictions do they have? In my case, my husband eats halal. You have to go to specialized markets to buy that type of food. And then that's the type of meals he's from the Mediterranean. Everything has to have like a tomato based. It's not like white sauces, right? It's just like, and sometimes I just give up. I'm like, have some cereal, get a sandwich, get a pizza. Their go-to meals are pizza and Subways. But then there's only so much pizza and Subways you can eat. After a while, you're like,
Absolutely, absolutely. As someone who's connected with you on social media, I love seeing your photos, and I love watching what you cook, and I think it's beautiful. Comment just, thanks for the great presentation. And I said, your presentation, this is from Liliana, your presentation just enhanced the importance of creating awareness of the cultural enrichment that happens through food. How do you see food as we adopt and enhance food delicacies from other cultures?
That's interesting because I think we have to talk about the globalization of food. And, I have textbooks and just use different foods. There is there's a book that a journalist wrote, Taco USA, how Mexican food became Americanized, how the United States basically adopted Mexican food. The introduction of Gustavo Arellano's book talks about the burrito, the flour tortilla going into space with NASA once we had Chicano astronauts. And I just love sharing that story. Food is global, food is universal. And the flour tortilla does not create so many problems like bread does for NASA getting into crevices. But the fact is that people travel and they travel with their food, right? And they carry their grains, they carry their chile. If you open my suitcase, I mean, people will go through them and are like, what are you carrying? I carry cheese. I use sea salt from my parents' homeland from the Pacific Ocean of southern Mexico. I use a cheese that is so stinky that people are like, how on earth can you travel with this? I'm like, the stinkier the better. It's delicious. It's kind of cotija cheese, it's dry cheese. It stinks like dirty feet, but I love it, right? And so I have a like, do not touch cheese zone in my fridge. I'm like, whatever, just don't throw out my cheese, But I think this globalization, there is no pure culture. People have been blending with each other. I look at, what are the foods of the Americas? What have we given to the world? Vanilla, chocolate, chile, yam, potatoes. What would the rest of the world be without the food of the Americas? And with conquest and contact, people brought certain foods and then we modified them. And then there's the working class, working poor food of menudo. Like we clean up the innards and chop them up and add chile and hominy, and then we reclaim it as a popular weekend food that brings some nourishment to you. And for others who grew up with that food, they frown on it. And I remember having a speech therapist come to my house, and when I offered her mole, this beautiful dish, right? I love, my favorite is black Oaxacan mole. This dish, she looked at it and she's like, oh, it's disgusting. It looks like mud. I felt so rejected. I'm like, we're allowing you into our family, and I offered you something so wonderful and you rejected it without even trying it. I just didn't want that person in my house anymore. Right. And so I think we have to be open that people will gift you what they have. We have to be very careful of appropriation, but there is no pure culture. I love sharing my food and then finding similarities. I'm writing and cooking with a Pakistani American born and raised in Detroit, and somehow she's supposed to cook all the Pakistani foods. And she's like, I'm not born there. I was raised in Detroit, but she's trying to reclaim and salvage her food. And we've cooked together through Zoom. I'm like, okay, what are we gonna make today? And then I said, what do you want to learn to make that's Mexican? And she says, those red chile enchiladas that are not bitter. Like, how do you make your enchiladas that are not bitter? And I'm like, bitter? Like, I don't associate with bitterness. But she's like, I've tried making it, but I'm missing something. And I said, okay, we'll make it together. We'll make it together, and then your food will not be bitter. So I think technology allows us into different cultures. I also come from a part of the border where there's a strong Chinese Mexican presence. Chinese have really influenced the border cuisine in Calexico, Mexicali. And so Mexicans eat Chinese food. I love Chinese food. Nobody understands why. They're like, you're Mexican. What's up with you and Chinese food? I'm like, I grew up in this part of the border where we have like the best Chinese food ever. And it's a Mexican Chinese cuisine merger, fusion. It's just, I mean, we have these yellow chiles that get, put with soy sauce and vinegar and a little bit of lemon, and the skin pulls off and they're delicious. If you go to China and ask for those yellow peppers, I don't know if they're going to have them because it's so border. But that's who we are. I was on this podcast of these walks. We have these discos and we make these scalas. We throw everything on a walk. And they're like, is that a Chinese thing? I'm like, I would say yes, but it's also from an agricultural tradition because my parents were farm workers. And when they would discard the disc that they would use for agriculture purposes to process the land, when they're no longer sharp, they discard them. So farm workers would add handles to them, feet to them, double layer them. That's where you use either firewood or charcoal, and it's a big wok that you can use outside. It doesn't dirty your kitchen. And we fry fish, we fry chicken, we fry all these mystery meats together, and it makes this great meal, right? And so every time I'm like, oh, this is so fascinating. It's making do with what you have and creating these wonderful fusions, and everybody claims it as their own. But I think it's at the border, the Chinese were very important and continue to be a very important part of our border community, with building the railroad, with investing in different businesses. And one of the individuals I interviewed is Chinese Mexican. I was trying to do the interview in English, and he says, look, man, you got to do this in Spanish. I'm Chinese, but I'm Chinese Mexican. I speak Spanish. Here's this, like, okay, switch gears. I don't speak Chinese, but the guy speaks Spanish more. He speaks English or Chinese. And that is part of a rich border heritage and our diversity.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yes, I so many of these things I've actually seen, like especially the when I lived in Texas, I would see these Chinese Mexican restaurants, and you would think, what? And then you'd go in and you're like, okay, I got it. And then I learned of the heritage of the families who had like lived near each other and worked together and decided to bring something together. So really, I thank you for sharing that. From Aaliyah Deggs, I've learned a lot. I've learned that what we eat either can feed or reduce disease. How can we balance reclaiming our food ways while implementing healthier options and alternatives?
I'm going to say this. My mom was affected by COVID in 2020. We put her on a plant-based diet, and my mom's still alive. And her arms, her hands are strong. She still holds on to the hospital bed. And we're waiting. When it's her time, it'll be her time. But to eat Mexican food doesn't mean you have to eat everything smothered in cheese or fried. You can have lots of fruits and vegetables that are so good for you. And like, I'll make nopalito salad. Nobody else, because my family's from the tropics, they really don't eat a lot of cactus. But cactus is so good for regulating blood sugar and for fiber. Avocado, that's a fruit from Michoacan. It literally, I have to say this, aguacatl, it translates to testicle. You'll never eat an avocado without ever knowing that. I said, that's called avocado. It's called a testicle in Nahuatl. But what has avocado done? Like, you add avocado to a tostada or just eat it with a spoon, and it's good fat. You can have beans, lentils, yams, potatoes, cactus, black beans, brown beans. Add garbanzo beans. Garbanzos are a natural Prozac. They're an antidepressant. So anything I can add garbanzos in, and garbanzos are very popular because of the Lebanese influence in Yucatan, right? For a lot of, they eat hummus in the Yucatan Peninsula with the large Mayan community. They thought hummus was Mayan. I'm like, nope, that came from the old world through the Lebanese, came with the Spanish. And so there's these pockets of Afro-Latinos in Latin America and Mexico and the border, but there's pockets of Lebanese, pockets of Koreans, pockets of Chinese. There's this amazing merger, and we exchange our food, and we create, what would the Italians be without tomatoes? That comes from the Americas. What would the Irish be without potatoes? That comes from the Americas. So we have a lot of plant-based diet. I mean, I'll add black chocolate into my coffee, strong in antioxidants. And who doesn't like chocolate? I mean, you add that, I call it a Mexican mocha. There's this great little coffee shop in Balboa Park in San Diego. They'll sell you a Mexican mocha, and it's black Mexican chocolate, not the Hershey's syrup, high fructose corn syrup stuff. It's a real deal with coffee, and you now have a Mexican mocha, and I love it. I'm always like, introduce the traditional meals into your everyday life, and your life is richer and beautiful and savory. And a good compliment is when people say, I want to cook with you, I want to eat with you, I'm going to be in town, can we eat together? So I have a lot of lunch dates, dinner dates with colleagues coming to the border, because we enjoy trying these wonderful meals that reconnect us and give us beautiful memories. Sometimes, a zucchini, calabacita dish, it's zucchini, onion, garlic, tomato, chile, onion, cilantro. You saute them in a little bit of olive oil. It's a beautiful zucchini dish. Now, if you are not lactose intolerant, you can add a little bit of sour cream, a little bit of cheese, or you can add some chipotle peppers. And now it's like a whole different meal that you could eat in a tortilla or put on top of white rice. And it's a beautiful dish. and you're not going to be hungry because it's such a complex meal, and it's rich in so many vitamins and minerals and fiber. So you can live on a budget, you can reclaim your traditional foods and just incorporate more fruits and vegetables and legumes, beans and lentils.
Oh my gosh, I'm really hungry, but one thing I was gonna say is that the avocado, you reminded me when my daughter was little, and I lived in Texas, right? My doctor told me a great thing would be to scoop the avocado when she was like when she first started eating, scoop it right out and just feed it to her because that good fat is so good for brain development. And we don't even think about that, right? Because we're giving people kind of processed baby food and things, but it just reminded me of that. So thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely. It's, when my father passed away and my baby came preterm and my mom came to stay with us. And the first thing she fed my child was beans. And I'm like, Mom, he's still a baby. And she's like, I raised 5 kids with beans. Get out of my way. I'm like, okay. And then I remember going to California having a nephew. And then I cut the first avocado and started feeding him. And my brother's like, he's 6 months. He's a baby. I'm like, get out of the way. My mom raised us with avocados, with beans, with rice. And, we love, my parents were farm workers. Eat a salad a day, eat one salad a day.
Yeah.
Try to have a meatless Monday, eat more fruits and vegetables with every meal. You're never going to go hungry because that gives you fiber, it gives you vitamins. You don't have to, instead of having a second dish, you can, start with a salad that already nourishes you, gives you a lot of liquids, a lot of fiber, and then serve your dish, right? And go hungry, maybe you can have a fruit later on. And then a way of balancing your blood sugar levels is to walk 15 minutes after every meal. That's an excellent way of balancing. Walking is free if you're mobile. And there are people who no longer walk and they miss walking, right? And I, during the pandemic, there was no one outside, but I was there with my mask walking.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And Mary Beth, I know you walk a lot.
I do. I am all
your
about
life.
the walking. Yeah, it changed my life, makes me feel amazing. So Jonathan we've got about 5 more minutes and we got a few more questions here. So Jonathan has a longer statement and question. I'm just going to read it. I follow a non-for-profit Hunger House Ministries. They offer hundreds of meals to children in Juarez colonias and classes for those not in school. Being a faith-based organization, they operate primarily by volunteers, and to see the connection that food brings to these colonias, simple beans and rice, mole, etc., coupled with educating children who are not in school, there is a whole dynamic that is being engaged through the dimension of giving and receiving. It is really multi-generational and humbling to see. Do you see the future of food and cultures intermixing as a bridge for bringing people from several classes and societies and nationalities in a global context? It is really apparent in the border region, apparent in the border region like El Paso and Juarez. And I know you've done a lot of work in this area, so comments? I hope I read that properly.
Thank you. I want to encourage people, many of us have lost our way. We don't know how to grow food. So you can have container gardens, or even if you live in an apartment, grow some basil, grow some mint, grow some chile, tomatoes. I'm not there yet, but there's community gardens. I've had a student write her master's thesis project, volunteer at a community garden, learn what grows in the desert. It's amazing. That I think community gardens are amazing spaces for intergenerational connections, for interclass, interethnic relationships. We can learn from each other and learn from what grows here and incorporate, like eggplant. I got a call from Albuquerque and they said, we have all these Central American refugees and there's all these eggplants. They don't know what this is. Someone called, planta de huevo. They translate plant and egg. I'm like, no, it's not a plant from an egg. It's called berenjena, but it's not endemic to Central America. But here's a Moroccan recipe. Let's bring it in with onion, garlic, tomato, squish it, add some lemon, salt, pepper, cumin, and then it's a dip. Let's try this recipe, see if they'll eat it. I'm getting calls from food pantries of like, how do we create food pantry recipes? And I'm like, oh, that's fantastic, right? I've had 2 generations of students and they've created recipes, gathered recipes. But I had another student who wrote her thesis project on the food pantry on campus. If y'all don't have a food pantry, that's one thing you can start with students on campus. Have a food pantry and destigmatize food insecurity. I had students testify in a congressional hearing about food insecurity at universities and community colleges. So we need to bring awareness to hunger in spaces where we don't talk about hunger. But I've taught at 12 and I hear, and sometimes it's either you grab food or you pay for gas or you like make ends meet. And I know there's hunger on campuses. So community gardens, food pantries, these are amazing spaces where people can donate and gather when they need it and share strategies of what to do and make do with what we have. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. So, well, Pat is thanking you for such a beautiful and moving talk. And says your approach to foodways is very persuasive. I see all the ways in which women prepare and distribute food as forms of empowerment. Can you talk about how these low-income women express power despite their structural vulnerability?
Absolutely. I think, when you're the lady that makes bread and there's no bakery in your community, when you're the woman making these certain meals or braiding the chile and selling it and then complementing your household income, or this woman who packs her truck with chile and drives it to Colorado and sells it at a premium, she comes back and now she has enough money to replace the wheels on her truck or to complement her partner or her family's income. I think, we learned that when women work, your children will eat better. They'll dress better. If your children need shoes, because you made money on the side, you can now do it. Here, I see people when there's an economic emergency. My brother is a teacher, coach. His kids had a horrible car accident. And then there was a community tamale. They sold tamales. And he came with these bags. I'm like, dude, what are you doing? He's like, one of my kids had an accident and the family's making tamales and the community started buying them. And that's how they were able to pay for the hospital bills. I just see the food as an emergency reservoir, for people to be strategic, to bring in these traditional meals that people love and that's super labor intensive. Not everybody, that's why they're only around the holidays because they're very intensive. And some of us didn't grow up making them. My mom did not make tamales, right? And she never had to. She was a healer. She was a traditional curandera. So she's like, I don't have to make them. I help a lot of people and people will bring me tamales. And that's how we kind of reconcile that. All right, we won't go hungry because my mom gives and we receive. And I think my grandmother did that. And these are generations of healing, of caring for others and knowing that the community is going to care for you back.
Thank you. And that's all the time that we have. And I want to say thank you so much, Gina. This was absolutely beautiful. I hope everyone learned as much as I did. In addition to loving just listening to you and your warmth and your care for community and food. It was really wonderful. And I did want to give a little thank you to Natalie and Brandy for hosting our tech and helping us with all the logistics. And to all the participants, thank you for the absolutely wonderful questions. So thank you, Gina. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful.
And I know this was recorded. So thank you, Mary Beth, Brandy, and Natalie for recording this session. We can make it available. And then you can always invite me to give a talk at your university or your community. And then we can exchange ideas. I think people will say, can you give me recipes? And I say, well, what do you want to know how to make? And then saying, well, you share something with me as well, right? I went to a funeral and had the best peach cobbler. I'm like, this is so good. And they're like, you're way too excited about peach cobbler at a funeral. It was my cousin's funeral. I'm like, I'm so sorry. I was too enthusiastic, but I didn't grow up with peach cobbler. I just thought like, this is amazing. Who made this? And they're like, we're at a funeral. I'm like, oh, sorry. So I'm very open to learning and to exchanging. This is something we can give and take. So thank you so much for hosting.
Absolutely. And we will, like Gina said, we will be sending a recording. We'll also post it all over our social media and we'll send you a follow-up email with more information. So just thank you, everybody. And thank you, Gina. We just really loved having you with us. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.